Imagine a 6-year-old girl, trembling as she steps into a wedding dress far too heavy for her fragile body, golden embroidery digging into her shoulders, jewels glinting under hundreds of flickering candles. The cathedral towers around her, its stone walls echoing the thunderous sound of the organ. Nobles from across England and France watch silently, their faces masks of curiosity and expectation, while she walks forward, not as a child, not as a daughter, but as a piece in a political game decades in the making. Every careful step is a reminder that her childhood has been stolen, that her innocence has been traded for alliances, gold, and power. This is the story of England's forgotten queen, a girl whose life was dictated entirely by the ambitions of others, a girl married at 6 and dead by 20. Her name was Isabel of France, and by the time she could barely grasp the meaning of adulthood, her life had already been claimed by history. Isabel was born into a world of wealth, power, and constant danger. Her father, Charles V of France, known to history as Charles the Mad, was once a brilliant ruler whose intellect and strategic thinking had shaped the course of his kingdom. But as Isabel grew, the king's mind betrayed him in terrifying ways. Some days he was lucid and commanding, issuing orders and attending councils as a capable monarch should. On other days, he imagined assassins lurking in every shadow, attacked his own soldiers in a blind rage, or fled from invisible enemies who haunted his palace. The queen, Isabel's mother, saw opportunity where others saw chaos. While her husband cowered in secret chambers, she accumulated wealth, took lovers, and maneuvered for influence. Isabel, from her earliest days, witnessed the cruel pragmatism of power. Survival meant obedience, observation, and silence. Her toys were miniature courts where she learned diplomacy. Her bedtime stories were lessons in governance, negotiation, and the cold calculations that ruled her family. There was no place for laughter or play. By the age of 5, her life had already been planned for her. Historical records reveal the chilling reality. Iron bars installed on her chamber windows to prevent escape, letters detailing her every movement, and chroniclers who documented her childhood not as a life to be cherished, but as an asset to be managed. Her father's madness, her mother's ambition, and the schemes of courtiers all converged to ensure that Isabel would be ready when the English proposed a marriage that would secure peace and fortune. King Richard II of England, desperate for heirs and eager to stabilize relations with France, saw Isabel not as a girl, but as a living investment. The negotiations were brutal in their clinical detachment. Men in velvet robes debated her health, her posture, even the alignment of her teeth, discussing her as if she were livestock rather than a human being. At 6 years old, Isabel's life was no longer her own. Every day, every gesture, every thought of hers was preordained by adults whose concern for her welfare was secondary to their desire for wealth and power. The preparations for her wedding were extravagantly cruel. 12 dresses, 40 ceremonial gowns, jewels passed down through generations, all designed for a child whose tiny frame could barely bear their weight. Her mother oversaw every detail, relishing the triumph of a political masterpiece, while her daughter's needs were largely ignored. On the day of the wedding, the cathedral was transformed into a spectacle of opulence and terror. Candles burned so brightly they made the shadows dance wildly across the polished stone. The organ boomed with each note, filling the air with a sound that must have been both awe-inspiring and overwhelming for a child. At the altar, Richard II waited, tall, elegant, and dressed in robes that were more valuable than the holdings of entire noble families. The bride, barely able to comprehend the events unfolding around her, was led down the aisle, her voice caught in her throat when asked to consent. Only when prompted did she whisper the 2 words that would seal her fate. "I will." 2 words that condemned her to a life she did not choose. The journey from Paris to Calais was 2 weeks of terror and disorientation. Her French attendants were replaced with English caretakers who spoke a language she could barely understand. Every familiar object, even her beloved wooden doll, was taken from her. She clutched it tightly, pressing her fingers so hard that they bled, seeking comfort in a world that had become alien and frightening. At Calais, she was handed over in a ceremony that resembled a hostage exchange more than a wedding. The transfer of authority, the signing of papers, the exchange of gold, all performed as if she were a commodity rather than a child with thoughts, fears, and hopes. From that moment, her life in England would define her as property rather than personhood, and the world she knew in France became nothing but a memory fading with every passing mile. Arriving in England, Isabel was thrust into a culture she could not navigate, surrounded by people she could not trust, and forced to learn a language and customs that were entirely foreign. Her French attendants were gone, replaced with English ladies-in-waiting who did not speak her tongue. Her toys, her clothing, and even her pony, which had been her last comfort, were taken away. The English court attempted to dress the experience in celebration and grandeur, parading her through towns and holding festivals in her honor. But Isabel, exhausted, frightened, and homesick, could not understand the cheering crowds. Every smile, every bell, every song was a reminder that she was a stranger in her own life, stripped of safety and agency. She felt as if she were being led to her own execution. In many ways she was. Her childhood had been stolen, and the world she entered in England was only marginally less cruel than the one she had left behind, could not comprehend, perform dances she could barely follow, and speak a language that was constantly beyond her grasp. Even Richard II, the man to whom she had been married, combined gentleness with authority in a way that reminded her constantly of her captivity. He allowed her some comforts, books, toys, a small white pony named Blanche, but these gestures existed within the framework of control. She was never free. She was always on display, admired for her ability to maintain composure and intelligence while being powerless to make choices about her own life. Even the smallest decisions, where she could go, what she could say, whom she could see, were dictated by others, a constant reminder that she was not her own master. Years passed, and the weight of isolation and oppression grew heavier. Letters from her family were heavily censored, visits were limited, and she remained a pawn in a game of diplomacy that she could neither understand nor influence. At 10, her husband was deposed and removed from power, leaving her a queen in title only and a prisoner in reality. She was a hostage, a living guarantee that her family and the French court would remain obedient to the agreements set forth by her marriage. For 3 long years, from 10 to 13, she lived in gilded captivity, where her every action was observed and her every word monitored. Yet even in this harsh environment, Isabel learned the art of survival. She smuggled letters to her family, feigned illness to gain sympathetic attention from physicians, and navigated the dangerous waters of court politics with a wisdom far beyond her years. At 13, she returned to France, but the girl who stepped off the ship was irrevocably changed. Her body had grown, but her spirit bore the marks of years of trauma. Her father's madness had returned, and her mother regarded her less as a daughter than as a depreciated asset in the marriage market. Yet Isabel, shaped by hardship and fear, had learned to assert her own will. She refused a politically expedient marriage proposed by Henry IV's son, declaring with quiet courage that she would not be forced into another life she did not choose. Eventually, she married a man closer to her own age, a poet and gentle soul, finally tasting a measure of love and affection that had been denied her for so long. She bore a daughter and briefly experienced the joys of family and motherhood. But happiness was fleeting. Years of malnutrition, stress, and emotional trauma left her body weakened. Her health failed under the weight of childbirth and the pressures of courtly life. At 20, she died, clutching her child one last time. Chroniclers noted her passing in 3 lines, concerned only with political ramifications, ignoring the human tragedy of a girl who had been married at 6, widowed at 10, imprisoned until 13, and finally allowed a brief moment of love and motherhood before death claimed her. Her letters, her small acts of defiance, and the fragments of testimony that survived tell the story of a girl who endured unthinkable hardship and yet retained a spark of resilience, a desire to survive, and the ability to assert herself even when the world sought to crush her. Isabel's story is a lens through which we see the darker truths of medieval Europe, a world where children were considered property, where innocence was sacrificed for the ambitions of adults, and where human lives were subordinated to politics and power. Every letter, every document, every ledger reveals a systematic disregard for the welfare of children in royal households. The medieval era, often romanticized in literature and film, is filled with stories of suffering hidden beneath gilded walls and gold-embroidered gowns. Isabel of France deserves to be remembered not as a political figure, not as a queen, but as a child whose life was stolen, whose voice was silenced, and whose suffering provides a stark reminder of the human cost of ambition. Her legacy is not one of crowns or titles, but of resilience and endurance. In remembering Isabel, we are called to confront the uncomfortable truths of history, that innocence can be destroyed by the pursuit of power, that childhood can be stolen, and that humanity can be sacrificed for the ambitions of the few. She stands as a representative of countless children whose names are lost to history, whose lives were dictated by the desires of adults, and whose suffering was ignored by those who recorded history. When we romanticize the medieval period, we must also remember the children who cried for their families, who begged for freedom, and whose lives were taken from them long before they had a chance to live. Isabel of France is a haunting reminder of what happens when power and ambition are allowed to override compassion, mercy, and humanity.